Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Long, Long Way, Hollywood's Unfinished Journey from Racism to Reconciliation, by Garrett, read by Tom Perkins. The camera sees what you pointed at. The camera sees what you want it to see. James Baldwin, The Devil Finds Work. All the stolen voices will one day be returned. You too. The Miracle of Joey Ramone. 1. Introduction. A long, long way. Wake up, race and American film. We all need a myth to guide our lives, and if we don't claim a myth, one will claim us. Phyllis Treble. Movies are not about blacks, but what whites think about blacks. Ralph Ellison. On August 10, 2018, Spike Lee's movie BlacKkKlansman premiered in the United States, 1 year after white supremacists had marched in Charlottesville, Virginia. In the climactic moments of the film, echoing the editing of D.W. Griffith, who pioneered the art of cross-cutting between story elements to build suspense, Lee moves back and forth between two scenes in which Griffith's 1915 film The Birth of a Nation plays a pivotal role. In one, a Klu Klux Klan initiation ceremony led by Grand Wizard David Duke, Topher Grace, is capped by an approving and enthusiastic screening of the film, which helped to create the modern Klan. In the other scene, Jerome Turner, Harry Belafonte, describes to a room full of African-American students the 1916 lynching of his friend Jesse Washington, who was burned, castrated, and tortured in front of a crowd of 16,000 people in Waco, Texas, the place where I have taught for 3 decades. Jerome cites the birth of a nation as a cause for that horrific public violence, as indeed it was. These two scenes show how powerful a film can be in shaping or reinforcing attitudes about race, violence, and identity. The language of the camera, as James Baldwin tells us, is the language of our dreams, and of course our nightmares. But in Lee's film we also see how movies can push back against stereotypes, can speak truth to power, and can move audiences not to hate but toward understanding. Although it is set in the 1970s, in its final scenes, BlacKkKlansman connects the violence and racism of the distant past and of the movie's present with our own present. As critic Oliver Jones wrote, "Yes, this is a period movie. It's just that the period is now, then, before, and always." And Lee reminds us that while film can carry horrible messages, it can also offer the possibility of hope. With our clear-eyed awareness that movies and other media have been a force for bigotry and hatred, we can identify and reject myths that are soul-killing and seek out myths that are soul-filling. We can watch a film, recognize elements that are racist, stereotyped, or simplistic, and hold it to account, even as we seek out stories that embrace diversity and the full humanity of every character. In our history, as in BlacKkKlansman, race and the media are inextricably linked. Over the past century, racists have used the medium of film to perpetuate harmful stereotypes and offer warped narratives, or they have portrayed white reality as though it were the only reality that mattered. A second phase followed, as white filmmakers of conscience recognized that propensity for racism and sought to make incremental changes in the stories they told. Other white storytellers launched a third phase, attempting to portray the lives of people of color in a more significant and representative way. Later, in a fourth phase, people of color began to tell their own stories and portray their own lives. And in a fifth phase, Hollywood films began to display a casual multiculturalism in which racial difference is taken for granted. Finally, we arrive at the sixth phase, where, as in BlacKkKlansman, movies made for mainstream audiences by people of color are overturning the harmful myths of the past, denying the dangerous stories of American culture, and even turning the techniques and genres of Hollywood storytelling back upon themselves so that they become tools for awareness and reconciliation. The task of this book is to interrogate these 6 phases of Hollywood treatment of race, moving from our undoubtedly racist past to our still troubled but perhaps slightly more hopeful present. As a middle-aged white man, I can hardly make credible use of the word woke, yet it is a crucial idea to understand in connection with our current moment and the interrogation we are about to undertake. Spike Lee knows this. Before Erykah Badu, Trayvon Martin, and Black Lives Matter, his films were calling us to wake up. This call is the final line in School Days, 1988, and the opening line of Do the Right Thing, 1989. It echoes throughout BlacKkKlansman. All Americans, not just African Americans, are called to be awake, to pay attention, to look through new lenses to see what really is, as opposed to what we would like to or have been encouraged to see. Another middle-aged white man, David Brooks, defined it this way. To be woke is to be radically aware and justifiably paranoid. It is to be cognizant of the rot pervading the power structures. Thankfully, what we will find when we investigate the hatred and bigotry, the stories and the images of 100 years of Hollywood filmmaking is more than just rot. It's also a way forward. The Atlantic writer Van Newkirk and I were part of an onstage conversation about race, film, and healing that followed a screening of Get Out in Washington National Cathedral in February 2018. In his introduction to the film, Van talked about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s final Sunday sermon, delivered from the cathedral's Canterbury pulpit just behind us. It was, in one way, a standard theological examination. He begins with scripture from the book of Revelation, but then he goes to talking about the story of Rip Van Winkle, a fellow who fell asleep for 20 years and woke up. He fell asleep during the time the United States was controlled by the Crown and woke up in a post-revolutionary era. King used that example sort of as a parable to warn people about how to remain awake during a great revolution. What he talked about was how to stay woke, as lots of people stay. But also how to, if you were in the process of waking up, how to have your racial awakening, and how to get to the point where you could critically engage with life, with race, with becoming an anti-racist. That is the ultimate goal of our project, to critically engage with life and race. By exploring racism in American film from 1915 to the present, by exposing and rejecting the pernicious myths and embracing the good, by understanding how these films might lead and have led to useful conversations about race and prejudice, and by trying to become, in the process, anti-racist, we will offer correctives to Birth of a Nation in our past and to the neo-Nazis of Charlottesville in our present. Dr. King's goal, an America, a world where people would be judged less on the color of their skin than on the content of their character, remains elusive. Yet, it is a goal supremely worth seeking, and strangely enough our often racist literature and culture might be a part of our progress toward it. I began my formal research toward this work at a research library in the United Kingdom during July 2016. Just before I arrived, a national referendum in Great Britain, fueled to a large degree by nativist concerns about immigrants and refugees, had pushed that nation in the direction of cutting ties with Europe and trying to control the flow of people into their country. Brexit was all anyone there could talk about, until, within hours of each other, 2 African-American men were killed by police officers on camera, very publicly joining a sad roll call for that year to date of 500 deaths in America at the hands of police, with blacks 2.5 times more likely to be killed than whites. Shortly afterward, an African-American veteran, home from the Middle East, opened fire on police officers at a Black Lives Matter rally in Dallas, Texas, with a military-grade assault weapon. His sole motivation, he said before himself being blown up by military ordnance, was that he wanted to kill white policemen. Protests, shootings, and shouting matches followed. President Barack Obama cut short a state visit to Europe to return to the United States to deal with the crisis. Many Americans gave voice to anger, despair, or near hopelessness in regard to the questions of race and violence that were shaking our country. On the front page of its July 9th edition, The centrist London newspaper featured a banner headline that seemed aptly to characterize our new normal: America's Race-Hate Nightmare. Many people, including me, I must confess, tried to read the election of Barack Obama as marking a new chapter in American racial life. But by this summer of 2016, it was painfully clear that this early optimism was misplaced, that the idea that we were living in a post-racial society was purest delusion. A comprehensive study by the Pew Research Center found that blacks and whites continued to view events and issues in wildly different ways, that racial optimism stemming from the election of an African-American president had subsided for whites and blacks both. While whites thought there was too much focus on race, blacks thought there was not nearly enough. Although whites were evenly divided on the state of race relations, by a nearly 2-to-1 margin, blacks are more likely to say race relations are bad, 61%, rather than good, 34%. In his 2016 study of President Obama, Michael Eric Dyson identified what seems to be an inescapable truth about our continuing struggle. What many Americans of all colors believe is that race fundamentally defines America and is a dividing line drawn in blood through the nation's moral map. But white and black people on either side of that dividing line view race and prejudice in fundamentally different ways. At about the same time that I began working on this book, although entertainment news seemed, at first glance, hardly so weighty as the front-page headlines, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences announced that it was inviting new members to join. 46% of the nominees women, 41% of them people of color. This was widely perceived as a response to the #OscarsSoWhite controversy and an attempt to combat the perception that the Academy, and the entertainment industry as a whole, was racist or, at the very least, complicit in barring people outside the white mainstream from wider recognition and opportunity. Ignited by the second straight year in which the Academy failed to nominate a single African American for a major award, the #OscarsSoWhite social media campaign swept the nation and the world in early 2016. Reactions were predictably varied. Many, were appalled that the year's group photo of Oscar nominees looked like a vast bowl of vanilla ice cream with a jot of caramel in it. Mexican director Alejandro González Iñárritu, who won his second straight Best Director trophy for The Revenant, was the sole person of color nominated in a major category. Others suggested that perhaps no African-American performances were worthy of nomination. Still others claimed not to understand what the fuss was about. All of these responses, however, entered into the larger American dialogue about race, prejudice, opportunity, justice, racial violence, difference, and representation. As perhaps our greatest mythmaker, what Hollywood thinks about race does matter. Actual racial violence and the representation of race in American culture are connected because Hollywood, pop music, television, and other cultural media have long excluded people of color, have depicted them as subhuman or unimportant or as stereotypes, have refused to allow them to tell their own stories, and have given greater exposure to whites at the expense of perhaps equally talented people of color. Any objective media history of African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, Jews, Native Americans, Italian Americans, members of the LGBTQ community, and other minority groups reveals a century or more of prejudice, insult, injury, and neglect, a century of works that have shaped their audiences and members of those groups in ways benign and malignant. Our primary focus in this work will be on African American representation and oppression, but a similar work, full of sadness and full of hope, could be written about any of these groups. As a culture, we have regressed since the summer of 2016. America is now more obviously divided on racially charged issues like law enforcement and immigration than at any moment in my lifetime. At the end of 2017, 60% of those polled by the Pew Research Center said that the election of Donald J. Trump had worsened racial tensions. A majority of black respondents said that racial tensions overall have increased. Republicans, and white Americans in general, were both less likely to believe this and more likely to opine that racial tensions are largely unchanged and not a serious problem. Yet the worsening racial climate notwithstanding, the past 100 years offer us a history of tiny strides, moments of grace and understanding, universally appreciated performances and transformative narratives, and some movement toward true equality. Perhaps America is now the land of Muslim bans and diatribes against immigrant rapists and murderers, but it is also the land of Moonlight, 2016, Get Out, 2017, Black Panther, 2018, and BlacKkKlansman. We are not in the promised land yet, but there are signs of hope. Race and representation. We've come a long, long way. In 1966, Dr. King spoke at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, then, as now, a bastion of white privilege. He said this: "I guess, probably more than any other question, the one that I get over and over again as I journey around our nation is the question whether we are making any real progress in race relations. I guess the only answer that I can give to that question is what I consider a realistic one. It avoids the extremes of both a deadening pessimism and a superficial optimism. I would say that we have come a long, long way in our struggle to make justice a reality for all men, but we have a long, long way to go before the problem is solved." Perhaps all those that Dr. King would call people of goodwill would agree that the racism and prejudice in our culture continue to offend our Creator, who sees us all as beloved children. But as a film historian and cultural theologian, I can make this initial statement about race and film in America. We have come a long, long way, even if we still have a long, long way to go. In the early years of American film, audiences received a vision of African Americans, Asian Americans, Arabs, Native Americans, and other cultures outside the white middle-class mainstream that was almost always filtered through the sensibility of white male writers and directors, and often through the performances of white actors as well. From the corked-up villains of The Birth of a Nation to Russian-born Jewish Al Jolson singing in blackface, from Swedish actor Warner Oland as the Chinese detective Charlie Chan and Hungarian Peter Lorre as the Japanese detective Mr. Moto, to white actors and stunt people in dark makeup as Native Americans, minority groups were often denied even the solace of seeing themselves depicted by actors from their culture. It's no wonder that in the early 1960s, James Baldwin would write that the world is white, and black people, and others outside the white mainstream, were forced to define themselves in opposition to this whiteness, and often to despise themselves because they did not share it. Ta-Nehisi Coates said something similar in his National Book Award-winning Between the World and Me. That beauty that Malcolm X pledged us to protect, black beauty, was never celebrated in movies, in television, or in the textbooks I'd seen as a child. Everyone of any import, from Jesus to George Washington, was white. We were black, beyond the visible spectrum, beyond civilization. Whether misrepresented or left out of the media, people of color did not see themselves portrayed in the culture. They could not have their lives confirmed in the way white audiences did without even a thought about it. As a white person, I saw myself and lives like mine depicted on TV and in the movies from my earliest days. I now understand, as I did not before beginning this book, that this was an important force in creating my identity and validating my presence on the planet. Film, media, and other cultural depictions, or vacuums, matter because they are powerful ways that people create meaning. When a population is constantly depicted in a certain way, those depictions take on a mythic life of their own. People who are consistently excluded from depiction begin to define themselves in terms of that very exclusion, an awareness that they are not normal or mainstream, that in some important sense they and their stories are outside of history, somehow not worth telling. When the Second Avenue subway in New York City opened in early 2017, the new stations were adorned with large and colorful mosaics. The art elicited powerful responses and actually brought some onlookers to tears. On Sunday, New Yorkers were mesmerized by the artwork adorning the walls. At the 72nd Street stop, Sumana Hariharaswara stopped to gaze at a mosaic of a woman of South Asian descent dressed in a burgundy sari, looking at her cell phone. Ms. Hariharaswara was overcome with emotion. "I don't think I've ever come across subway art before that makes me feel so seen," she said through tears. "This woman could be my aunt. She could be my cousin." She and a stranger exchanged a knowing glance. Representation matters, they agreed. Ms. Hariharaswara, a longtime transit enthusiast from Astoria, Queens, said she was struck by the diversity portrayed in the mosaics, including a mural of a gay couple holding hands. Her Murtaza, one of my Muslim students at Baylor University, wrote in his reading journal in the fall of 2017 that to enjoy a story, he had to find himself in it somehow. He expanded his thinking in a later email by saying, "One pillar to Black Panther's success was quenching a need for representation on the big screen. There are plenty of stories that I feel I am not represented in, whether that be in simple terms such as life experiences or personality, or in terms of race. There are times where the lack of representation can be off-putting or disheartening. However, what's worse is representation in a negative aspect. For me, an example would be a broad stroke, painting Muslims to be terrorists." The director of the acclaimed 2016 film Moonlight, Barry Jenkins, echoes her thought. Representation does matter. If you do not see your face, it is as if you do not exist. If you cannot find yourself in the stories and culture you consume, where are you? Who are you? And in terms of the culture itself, what are you? Setting aside the question of enjoyment, when a buffet of white people is all that's on offer, these myths shape all of the audiences who consume them, including white mainstream audiences. When you define yourselves in terms of characters who are consistently depicted as superior to all others, it is hard to avoid the sense, conscious or unconscious, that you are truly above others. Not to see yourself can be damaging. To see yourself and the life you live up there on the screen larger than life, in the same place where John Wayne and Humphrey Bogart and Marilyn Monroe and Julia Roberts have lived and died, loved and fought, elevates your existence. You are seen and affirmed. You are real. I had seen myself on screen from my childhood and did not for many years think about the fact that others did not have that luxury. The African-American theologian, Kelly Brown Douglas, had a different experience. Evoking a transformative, for me, conversation she and I had previously had, she told an audience at a screening of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, 1967, at the Washington National Cathedral about her first viewing of the movie and why it mattered so much to her. "I could not wait to see the black man in the movie that all the adults were talking about. From the minute that Sidney Poitier came onto the screen, I was transfixed, and I will admit that I've been transfixed by him ever since. But most importantly, at that time, for me, it was monumental, for this was the first time that I saw a black man, in fact any black person, in a major movie role. As an 11-year-old growing up in a time when the most black representation that I saw on the screen was that of Buckwheat and Stymie from Little Rascals and Amos and Andy, seeing a proud black man was, for me, consequential. It made me proud. To see him was to see the black men that I knew, proud black men. And so the point of the matter is that, even though I was not really the targeted demographic of the film, in that it was really, I think, not written for those who looked like me, it mattered to me. It wasn't about the interracial couple, though my friends and I had plenty of conversations about that, but it was about seeing the black people, especially seeing a black doctor, on the screen. Conversations about film with the very Reverend Dr. Douglas, who was a canon of the cathedral and dean of Episcopal Divinity School, have shaped my perceptions as a critic and theologian as well, because they have taught me that when white film-goers see lives that do not look precisely like theirs, faces from other cultures and other races depicted on the screen, it likewise normalizes them. In Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Sidney Poitier appears alongside screen icons Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, and on the movie poster he is given equal stature. If we can imagine seeing a black face here, couldn't we also imagine seeing a black face elsewhere? Asked why today he loves science fiction, Senator Cory Booker answered with a story about his father, who made me watch Star Trek with him to see an African-American woman and an Asian man as a view of the future. For a man who, in the 60s, when the show came out, was dealing with unconscionable discrimination, Star Trek, 1966 through 69, was a hopeful beacon. My dad brought me up to understand that art, even in the most unconscionable, painful, degrading present, can help us pull ourselves and our society to a higher level. At its best, that is what art can do, and why film representation matters. But Ralph Ellison's pungent comment that films are about what white people think about black people speaks to those times when minorities have been badly or untruthfully depicted in our culture by white storytellers. Sadly, in the first 50 years of Hollywood, what whites thought about blacks, or about any minority group, was often, and here's that word again, appalling. As we learn from Donald Bogle's classic study, Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, 1973, and Marlon Riggs's Emmy-winning documentary Ethnic Notions, 1987, for hundreds of years American material and popular culture regularly placed black characters into narrow and demeaning stereotypes, and tended to depict them as less than fully human, often as mere products of their biological impulses. At that February 2018 event at the Washington National Cathedral, the very Reverend Dr. Douglas wondered why for so long these characters were depicted in such a way. What was it about white America, and what were they trying to say to white America about black people? Our conclusion was that the consistency of these tropes could only be explained by the fact that white audiences liked or even needed to see black characters depicted in these ways. And it can only be explained if, as Bogle says, these stereotypes were included in film and culture to entertain and confirm white audiences by stressing Negro inferiority. These stereotypes had plenty of company. Material and popular culture tended to denigrate and degrade all ethnic and cultural groups outside the white Anglo-Saxon mainstream. The 1934 Warner Brothers musical Wonderbar presented Al Jolson and a seeming cast of thousands in blackface performing the musical number Going to Heaven on a Mule. Jolson sings of a place where pork chops grow on trees and watermelons abound. The sequence contains so many offensive stereotypes that it's hard to imagine it could be surpassed if the makers of Family Guy or South Park today had set out to be deliberately provocative. Equally offensive to us now, although perhaps at least understandable as wartime propaganda, is the representation of Japanese people as jabbering buck-toothed simians in films and cartoons, including Disney cartoons, released during World War II. These are only two of many occasions when films and other forms of popular culture presented a way to keep non-whites in their place, a place distinctly below or in opposition to white Americans. When minority actors were permitted to depict themselves, they were often placed in bit roles. D.W. Griffith employed white actors in blackface for all the meaty villain roles in The Birth of a Nation, while black actors and actresses were seen only in the background. The astonishingly talented singer and actress Lena Horne often found herself featured in extraneous musical numbers that were not integrated into the plot of the film. In southern states where black performers could not be shown in theaters, her footage was thus easily and unnoticeably cut before the film was screened. But despite all this, Hollywood, like the nation, wanted to do better and was wrestling with thinking about race in new ways. Some strong characters of color emerged. In 1940, Harriet McDaniel, though literally cast as Mammy, became...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?